All right, hello and welcome to this Lightning Shred Druid endgame guide. So this build is something that's been in the works for quite some time, and I want to preface this by saying the timing of releasing this, of course, is not super great. This is the day before the big patch for the new season, so obviously there should be some things that are going to change between now and literally tomorrow. Because of that, keep an eye on the channel, keep an eye on the max roll guide. I will be making adjustments, whatever needs to be done. Hopefully there's not too much that needs to change, but we won't know until we get all the patch notes tomorrow and can actually go and test this stuff. I'll be spending a ton of time in testing over the next few days for not just this build, but for the other builds that are on max roll. So all of these things are going to be updated as we go. Hopefully though, I don't see any reason why this build won't survive. You never know with Blizzard, but I do believe this is still going to be a strong build going into season 1, which is why we're still releasing it. So keep an eye on all that. But here's what we have as of now. This is a very, very good build, a very strong build, an extremely fast build. One of the fastest clear builds in the game. The video footage I have here, I believe that's a 3-minute clear on that dungeon, and it wasn't anywhere close to perfect by me. It was just a pretty standard thing. At one point I even get stunned for a good bit of time. So this build can go quite a bit faster than even what you're seeing in the gameplay footage. So that makes it really one of the best farmers in the game, bar none. Probably the best farmer for Druid, although a Lightning Storm is also very fast, but personally I would put this one faster than that as we speak right now. So if you're looking for a really good farm build, or you like really fast builds, or you like the Raycore style from Diablo 3, that is what this build is. And if you're into that, I think you're really going to enjoy this. I have built this thing to feel really good once you get all the Paragon stuff going, get your gear right. The spirit management is still there, but we're trying to make that as minimal as possible so you can literally shred just about the entire dungeon without having to worry about your generator. There'll be a few cases here and there where you get a lot of single target, your Grizzly Rage is down, etc., where that might be the case. You need to do a couple of storm strikes, but for the most part you will be able to just continue to spam shred and teleport from enemy to enemy, doing really large amounts of damage. Okay, with all that being said, with the baseline down, let's go ahead and get into the actual guide. And we'll, of course, start with the pros and cons. So the pros side, we've got high mobility, very high mobility. Again, one of the fastest builds in the game. It has very strong healing through Masochistic and through Shred itself. It is relatively tanky. It has a lot of ways to build damage reduction. It is a melee build, though, so as we'll talk about in a minute, there's a downside there. And it has just incredible clear speed, just insane. It's going to be, if you were into speed, I can't say it enough, you're going to love this build. The downsides, we have spirit management on here. Honestly, once you get it up and running, spirit management is relatively low compared to some builds, but it still needs to be done. If you run out of spirit, you won't be able to shred, and so you have to keep an eye on that, and sometimes pop a storm strike or some other option like a hurricane to get your spirit going. It is Grizzly Rage dependent, maybe not as much as you would think. It can still run when Grizzly Rage is on cooldown, but when Grizzly Rage is up, it's absolutely insane. That is when it's just clearly the strongest. This is a build that wants Grizzly Rage up as much as possible, and so we build into that pretty heavily. It is a melee playstyle, which makes it dangerous. All melee playstyle are dangerous. You have to be much more careful. You can't avoid all of the damage, so you have to try not to get too much damage, especially in hardcore or when pushing in nightmare dungeons. So that's always going to be a negative for a melee build. And it does struggle at high nightmare tiers, largely for the reason we just mentioned, that it's a melee build. It can build to be tanky, but it still is going to shred into the middle of packs. Like, that's just going to be a thing it does. We'll talk about this later, but also is susceptible to explosions. Because it's shredding constantly, explosions go off sometimes. It just can't get out in time. That's not great for hardcore, so it's also not great for nightmare dungeons, so that is something to keep in mind. Saying it struggles, though, is a relative thing. It can still do probably 80s, maybe even 90s. It's relative to other builds. It can still be a pusher, just doesn't have the highest potential like some of the other builds do. Okay, let's go ahead and get into the build. So the skills that we're going to use, of course, we're using Shred. That is a primary skill here. It's just going to do all the damage along with Stormclaw's aspect. We're going to scale the crap out of that. It's a very high damage build under most circumstances. Storm Strike is our spirit generator, also provides damage reduction, and is a reliable source of vulnerability on single target. So that will be used a lot on single target scenarios where you don't have a vulnerability. Just use it a couple times, vulnerability should be up, and then you can annihilate the enemy. Grizzly Rage, we talked about that a little bit already. Grizzly Rage is in most Druid builds right now because unstoppable, because of the movement speed buffs, because of the spirit cost reduction. That's especially good on this build. And the critical strike damage boost we can get from aspect of the Rampaging Werebeast, which goes up to something like 990% critical strike damage when it scales fully up. That's a ton of damage. So Grizzly Rage is just crazy good. Blood Howl is a good heal that's also going to provide us either attack speed in the final form of it or additional spirit gen earlier when you need more. So it serves a dual purpose, so to speak. Well, 3 when you include the heal. But either you'll get a lot of attack speed from it, 15%, or you'll be able to use it as a spirit generator that's up a lot because it reduces the cooldown on every kill, and you're going to kill extremely fast. So it has a lot of value in this build. Cyclone Armor is just good damage reduction with a knockback that can be used in Grizzly Rage, making it a really easy choice. Hurricane gives us a ton of healing from Masochistic, speeds up the damage ramp up from Rampaging Werebeast, and also it gives us a lot of spirit gen on crits. So Hurricane is really, really good value for this build, especially when we're trying to go fast, when we're trying to speed farm. Hurricane is excellent. As far as passive go, there's quite a few, of course, but the ones we want to hit on in particular. Toxic Claws is how we're going to apply poison for any of the wild poison effects we have, like in Venom. So when enemies poison, more crit damage. And Venom's actually a multiplier, very, very strong. There's other sources too, like damage reduction from poisoned enemies. All these things rely on Toxic Claws to apply poison when we crit, which we're going to crit just about all the time if you're running the speed farm version, and even if you're not, you'll crit a lot of the time, so everything's going to be poisoned very quickly. The Keystone passive is a notable thing here. We're going to use Lupine Ferocity most of the time in this build. It's going to give us more crit. It's going to give us a multiplier every 6th attack. A solid choice. Will mention, though, if you're going speed farming and you're going to run Waxing Gibbous, which we'll get to later, we will switch this out for Ursine Strength. Ursine Strength is a better choice in that scenario. So if you're running Waxing, Ursine. If you're not running Waxing, Lupine. All right. Let's go ahead. This will have some gameplay footage here real soon. So when you get on there, you'll actually see the gameplay footage. As far as Spirit Boons, we're going to go with Scythe Talons, Swooping Attacks, Wariness, Calamity, Masochistic. I want to explain one choice we're not making here in a second, but let's go through what we are going with. Wariness, additional boss damage reduction, pretty easy choice right now. Scythe Talons, additional crit strike chance. You might be like, well, if you go Waxing Gibbous, maybe you don't take that. We still take it because you're not going to have Waxing Gibbous up on critical or on single target. So Scythe Talons is always going to be a choice that we make here. 5% crit is 1 out of every 20. That's very solid. Swooping Attacks is good for attack speed. This build likes attack speed, just goes faster and faster and faster. So we'll take that. If you find that you don't need the attack speed or want to be a little tankier, you can take Iron Feather instead. Calamity allows us to maximize our uptime of Grizzly Rage. 25% reduction of the cooldown on ultimates is exactly what we're looking for to try to keep Grizzly Rage up as much as possible. And Masochistic is our primary source of sustain, so it's a really, really good choice here. Now, one thing we're not taking that a lot of builds that Grizzly Rage do is Calm Before the Storm. You'll be like, why aren't you doing that if you want to maximize your Grizzly Rage? The reason why is it needs a nature skill. Shred is not a nature skill. Shred cannot become a nature skill. Shred is a werewolf skill and a physical. So we cannot, unfortunately, access Calm Before the Storm. It also does not work with Stormclaw's aspect. That doesn't proc it. We tested it, doesn't work. And Hurricane's lucky hit strike chance is actually terrible. It looks good. It says what, 24%, I think. That seems to be 24% over the duration. So one quarter of a chance to get one lucky hit every time you use Hurricane is just horrendous. So it's just not worth taking Calm Before the Storm, so we don't. All right, moving on to the Paragon board. I'm not going to go through the whole board here, but I will point out we have a starter board and a respec. The difference is the starter board is prioritizing really important things early to make sure that when you get into the end game, you can get those things quickly. Things like Lust for Carnage, where you get the crit or the spirit restoration from spirit, or the spirit restoration from crit, excuse me. things like reclamation and the surrounding points for spirit on kill. These things are really, really important to smooth out the build, and so we prioritize them early. However, doing so isn't the most efficient way to use the board, and so later, much later, around 95 or so, we will respec to optimize it and get additional power from a more optimized board. But start with a starter one, and then you can go to 95-ish before you make that respec, so you'll be in this board most of the time. As far as glyphs that we take, exploit is just awesome for pretty much everything right now. You get the vulnerable anytime an enemy is damaged by you for 3 seconds. Almost everything dies in 3 seconds as built anyway, so that's the primary source of your vulnerable right there. Werewolf, damage reduction, and damage in werewolf form. We're always in werewolf form pretty much, so that's great. And certainly always in werewolf form whenever damaging anything, because Shred's a werewolf skill. Territorial, more damage reduction, damage to close enemies. You're usually close to enemies, so that's good. And also, I should point out, it's not entirely clear if you dash into from Shred whether that counts as close or not. You would think it is. Don't yet quite know, but even if it's not, you'll still get this up a lot of the time. Spirit is a good one for the increased damage from critical strikes. We're critting all the time. Core skills is not super ideal here because technically Stormclaw's aspect is not a core skill. We're going to talk about Stormclaw's aspect a little bit more here in a minute because Stormclaw's aspect scales incredibly well with certain stats. Core skills does not seem to be one of them. However, Shred does scale with it, and Shred itself scales Stormclaw's aspect. I hope this isn't too confusing. Basically, Shred procs a Stormclaw's aspect every time you crit. The more damage Shred does, the more damage Stormclaw's aspect does. So scaling Shred is still good for both because Shred does a lot of damage, and then Stormclaw's aspect actually does more damage. So this is still a good thing. It's just not quite as good as if we had a stat that would benefit both. Fang and Claw is going to be really good to increase our damage reduction and our damage. Of course, the increased damage from us. Close enemies take increased damage from us while in werewolf form. Again, we're not entirely sure how the dash works with that, but we'll be close to enemies most of the time anyway, so most of the time this will be up, even if that's not the case, and I do think close does work. Okay. Level 15, this is your order. Level 21, we change it. This is a very minor difference. Don't worry too much about this. You're going to want to scale all these up to 21 anyway, so it's not a big deal. All right, as far as gameplay goes, this is basically your rotation. This is the end game rotation. Once everything is filled out, you have a Tempest Roar, etc. This is what you're going to want to use. You're going to activate Blood Howler Cyclone Armor to proc Vigilance. Vigilance is damage reduction for 6 seconds, so you should be able to keep this up 100% of the time. You're going to use Hurricane, and you're going to use Grizzly Rage right before you enter the fight, and then you're going to go in with Shred, and you're going to shred the crap out of them. You're just going to shred until they're all dead, basically. That is effectively what you want to do. If the fight takes a while, you can rotate between using Blood Howl and Cyclone Armor to keep Vigilance up, prioritize Blood Howl to keep your attack speed up, or Spirit Regen if that's what you're using, which you'll be using earlier. Either or, you still want to prioritize it. And Cyclone Armor can also be used to create some distance between enemies, which makes it easier for you to dash, which is nice because dashing is going to do more damage because it hits everything on the way. So it's actually going to hit more targets than if you don't dash. So we want to dash as much as possible. It's not the end of the world if we're not dashing, but that's going to be the maximum damage. We use Hurricane on cooldown in a fight or for engaging high density packs to get the most value out of it. Storm Strike will be used for additional Spirit when needed, which won't be much. And for additional damage reduction in to fights. It can also be used for vulnerability on single targets. If Grizzly Rage goes on cooldown, you do want to be careful when engaging enemies, as you won't have Unstoppable. Unstoppable is the way that you don't get CC'd. So choose your targets carefully when it is down. You can still fight, you can still kill things, you'll still do good damage. But if you go into hard CC stuff, you're going to have a bad time. In fact, in that video, I do it. So the gameplay footage, I do actually go in there, and I thankfully have up Hurricane. It heals me through it, but I could have died there. So just be careful. Don't do what I did. Do as I say, not as I do, and be careful when you're out of Grizzly Rage so that you don't get killed in hard CC. If you do find yourself in a tough situation, too many enemies nearby, use Cyclone Armor. Do knock back enemies. And if enemies do hit hard, you can always prioritize using Blood Howl as a heal over the Spirit Gen or the attack speed, so you can save it for when you take a hit, then use Blood Howl, so on and so forth. All right, let's talk a little bit about resource and cooldown management. Cooldown management is not a big deal in this. I'm actually going to flip these. We're going to talk about the second paragraph first because it's just a little easier to talk about. It's not a big deal. compared to others because we can't use Calm Before the Storm, and so you're not trying to maximize the procs of that. So you just kind of run your rotation, and you'll have Grizzly Rage up for large periods, and then you'll have about 12 seconds or so downtime. Have it up, about 12 seconds or so downtime. The other thing we're really trying to maximize is Blood Howl, since it gets on kill, but if you're just going through and shredding a lot, it's going to be up almost all the time. So it's not a big deal, but you do want to make sure that you keep up. If you're using Preserving Blood Howl, you're keeping that 4 seconds as much as you can, that 15% attack speed, just to maximize the damage. And then if you're using innate Blood Howl, you're going to just try to use it when you're down on Spirit to gain more Spirit back. So you might want to save it for a little bit longer than you would on Preserving, depending on how your Spirit's looking. All right, let's talk about the resource stuff. So again, this build has been made to try to minimize the amount of time that you have to spend worrying about this, but to do so, you have to kind of pay attention to what's happening when you're hitting targets, how many you're hitting, when you're critting, etc. Lust for Carnage is going to be your primary source of spirit gen. It's only 2, but you can crit a lot. You can crit in a group. If you crit 6 times, that's 12 spirit. And this only uses Shred only uses spirit every 3rd hit. So you can definitely, just from this source alone, get enough spirit to be sustainable if you're in packs. If you're hitting single target, it will not sustain, unfortunately, but it will at least help. So this is a really strong part to the rotation. If you want to make it even stronger, and if you're speed farming, I recommend it, you can use Waxing Gibbous. Waxing Gibbous will give you a guaranteed crit for 2.5 seconds after you kill an enemy with Shred. When you are in speed farming mode, you should be doing no more than like 2 hits or so to kill most enemies, usually 1 hit. This is pretty much 100% uptime sustainable on non-single target scenarios, which means you'll be 100% crit chance, which means every single hit you do will give you 2 spirit. This makes it very easy to sustain your shreds, especially in Grizzly Rage, when we'll have a 50% reduction in spirit cost. This is going to be just keep you going. And if it didn't, or if you're not using Waxing Gibbous, then we still also are taking Paragon nodes, we talked about this earlier, that are increasing are giving you spirit on kill. You're gonna have I believe 4 spirit on kill, and if you're killing in every 1 to 2 hits, which most of the time you will unless you're pushing hard content, you're going to have a lot of spirit between those 2 things. But if you go into extended periods where you're fighting 1 or 2 enemies, you're going to run out, especially if Grizzly Rage is down. So keep an eye on that. If you don't have Waxing Gibbous, if you're not fully set up, Blood Howl, the Blood Howl option is always there, where you go to from Preserving Blood Howl instead of use innate Blood Howl, which I recommend you do until you get to the later end game. So use innate Blood Howl instead, then change over once your spirit is in a good spot. This will make a big difference because it does go off a lot. You have this available to you a lot. All else fails, or you don't want innate Blood Howl, you'd rather go Preserving. Storm Strike is always an option. It's always going to be there as a generator, and it doesn't take more than 1 or 2 hits to get it to go off. The last thing we can talk about is in packs, which are already good on, but you can get even better. Hurricane every time it crits, and when you have 100% crit chance for Waxing Gibbous, it will crit every time. Will give you spirit every time it does. It'll give you two spirit every time. Between these, if you rotate well, most of the time you will not ever have to touch Storm Strike. I can go through an entire dungeon without touching it. However, it's not always perfect. There are a few times where you will just, you'll see your spirits at like almost 0. Use a few Storm Strikes and you're good. And that's going to be about as easy as I can make that rotation for you as far as the spirit goes. Okay, let's move on to the end game gear, the skill progression, all that stuff. We have in here how you collect all the different things you need. Tempest Rory is something we want in the late end game. You don't need it, but it's going to make it better once you can get it. Before you get it, you won't be able to actually use Storm Strike. You'll have to use Claw, which is fine. You just won't get the vulnerable and the DR. You get the rest of the stuff though. So not a big issue there. Just bear that in mind. Waxing Gibbous, you find it. We talked about what that's good for. It's going to be a very smooth rotation with it, a little bit less damage on single target, a good bit less damage on single target, but still good damage on single target. A very easy thing to play with Waxing on. All right, as far as the starter, early end game, late end game setups, we'll just go through the major points here. You won't have Grizzly Rage early on because you're going to need Dire Wolves, which you gotta farm that. So we won't be able to take advantage of that at all. We'll be putting on Umbral just to give us a little bit more spirit. We won't be able to use is it Night Howlers? I can't remember. Oops, no, not like it's we won't be able to use Rampaging Werebeast either, so we'll use Rapid. We'll use Night Howlers in here versus accelerating because you won't have that either, which will give you more crit chance. So this stuff will all make the build still perform fairly well early game. As far as skills go, again, we don't have Grizzly Rage, so we'll switch to Earth and Bulwark to give us some Unstoppable, Barrier, and Fortify. And then use Innate Blood Howl for more Spirit, like we talked about earlier, over Preserving, and you'll still have a pretty smooth rotation. It won't be as smooth as late game, but whenever is it, it'll still be solid. Since we don't have an ultimate, we can also switch to Energize versus Calamity for even more Spirit generation, even smoother of a rotation. So trying to make this as smooth as I can early for you, but do bear in, I mean, I just can't make it as good as the end game. I wish I could. It'd be amazing if it was, but you'll see once you get into the late end game, just how smooth it is. But even earlier, it's still going to be better than a lot of builds. Early end game, we're going to switch into Grizzly Rage. So we're going to take Dire Wolves. We're going to take Rampaging Werebeast. We can, and this at this point, we're going to take out Might, and we're going to add Dark Howl because we still don't have Tempest Roar, so we'll gain access to Debilitating Roar while we're in Grizzly Rage. So that'll be instead of Cyclone Armor, which won't work. That'll give you some more defense. Not a big difference here, especially early on. You probably won't be taking crazy amounts of damage, but it's there for you. So it'll help out. Also, bear in mind at this point, we're going to be using Claw. Earlier in the starter, we did not need to use Claw because we weren't in Grizzly Rage, but now we are. So we'll have to switch to Claw because we cannot make Storm Strike a Werewolf skill without Tempest Roar. Late end game, now we've got Tempest Roar. Now we're good to go. Now it's all the stuff we talked about before. We can use Wax and Gibbous if we want to. You could technically use that early end game, but you probably won't have it. But at this point, you might have it. Go ahead and run that. We're gonna have Cyclone Armor available. We're going to have, and in fact, I need to put that in. We're going to have Cyclone Armor available to us. We're going to have, wait, no, this is Cyclone Armor, right? Oops. Yep, Cyclone Armor is going to be available, so I got to put that in here. We're going to have our full rotation. We're going to be good to go. Everything that we saw earlier is now going to apply. All right. Talk a little bit about the scaling stuff in here. There's a few things I want to talk about. I'm actually going to save some stuff on Storm Claws later, but do know that Storm Claws is going to take a percentage, up to 45%, I believe is the top end number on the amulet, of the total damage from Shred, including if it crits. And then it's going to scale it further through its own. So it has additive, multiplicative damage. It has a bunch of sources that it can also scale from. We don't know exactly every single one, but it seems to follow the pattern of if it fits whatever it's doing. So for example, if you're in werewolf form and you do it, anything damage while in werewolf form counts. It's a lightning skill, so lightning seems to count. It's not a core skill, so core doesn't seem to count, even though it counts for Shred, etc., so on. So you can take that 45% that you're going to get from Shred, and you can now scale it again, vulnerable, etc. It doesn't crit itself, but everything else it does. And then you can actually get it to be significantly more damage than Shred, like multiple times more damage than Shred. We'll talk about this a little bit at the end, but that's huge, and that's part of the reason why it does so much damage, even though Shred itself does a lot of damage. It does a ton of damage. So that's why it's in the amulet slot, because it's so strong. We talked about critical strikes already, how important they are. That's not any different here. Critical strike damage is mostly from Rampaging Werebeast. Vulnerable is amazing on every build right now. This one's no different. Storm Strike gives us some vulnerable. Exploit gives us vulnerable. Natural Hurricane is also on our build here for more vulnerable. Lots of vulnerable. Attack speed is really good in this build, so we do build accelerating and a couple of other sources. So yeah, the more attack speed you have, the faster you shred. The faster you shred, the more damage you do, so on and so forth. Envenom and Festering, we talked about this a little bit already too. Envenom is just a really, really powerful multiplier. Festering is also solid, especially in our Paragon board. And we use Toxic Claws to make it work. On defense, we heal a ton through Masochistic. We also do heal through Shred too. So we get a ton of healing. Armor is solid because of Disobedience. We are going to use that. We also have Iron Claw, the total armor while in werewolf form. So we have pretty good armor in this build. We also take some Paragon nodes. Defensive multipliers, we got Storm Strike. We've got Vigorous defensive, aspect, which is the 15% damage reduction while shapeshifted. These are going to be available to you. Well, Vigorous will be available to you all the time. Storm Strike on use. You can make that 100% uptime if you do it every 3 seconds. So it's a pretty good option. Venom Wall is all the poison stuff. So very, very strong. You have to make sure you're using Toxic Claws, which you should be if you're following the guide. So no problem here. Fortify is actually sneaky strong in this build. We're going to get it through Supreme Grizzly Rage, and then we're going to take a lot of damage reduction while fortified, and that's going to be a lot of damage reduction. Cyclone Armor we talked about earlier, it's passive DR, but it's also 30% damage reduction. Was it every 2 seconds? Yeah, for 2 seconds every 10 seconds. This doesn't go off until you get hit though, so it's actually going to be up a lot of the time when you're actually in combat, which makes it really, really strong. It's better than 20% uptime, and even though it looks like it's 20% uptime. Hurricane gives us a lot of healing. We can also switch to Savage Hurricane if we want to deal for enemies to deal less damage over Natural Hurricane for the vulnerable. In certain circumstances, we're going to do that. Most of the time, though, we'll use Natural. Okay, that covers everything on the scaling that I want to talk about. Stat priority gear options is very similar to this, so I'm going to go ahead and skip it now so we don't get this to be too incredibly long. It's already going to be a long guide, as they always are. Let's do the same thing here for stat priorities. I'll let you guys kind of just look through it as you want to. One thing of note here, maybe a couple of things to note. First off, Edge Master is the only thing we got in the weapon, even though technically you could use all this other stuff. That's because if you want to switch to Waxing Gibbous, this is the aspect you want to take off. If you put any other thing on your weapon, you're going to have a bad time because you're going to have to find a place to put that. You're going to have to switch out some stuff. So put Edge Masters on your weapon, and then if you want to use Waxing, you can always switch back and forth between these things as much as you want to. The rest of the stuff is all however you want. It's preference. It can go in any of these slots. Like this all can go in the totem. It's fine. As far as important stats on here, cooldown reduction is really important. Critical strike chance is important for sure. Spirit cost reduction is a good thing to have on your amulet, but not as important on the totem, because the totem spirit cost reduction is really low. So we kind of avoid that. Two sources of damage reduction are way better, along with CDR and crit strike chance. So we go with that. Let's see here. Anything else that pops out to me that you want? The 4 DRs on chests, great. 4 DRs on pants, same thing. Ranks of Shred, excellent on gloves. Really want that. Let's see. The other thing I want to talk about. Oh yeah, Envenom. Envenom's super good. I've got CDR above it. But these are basically tied. CDR is above it because of the Grizzly Rage, so you really, really want that. But Envenom is this is like 24% damage if you get the +3, like multiplied, like 24% more than you do without it. Try to get this. Spirit cost reduction just smooths out your build a bit, so it's really nice. And then the damage reduction. I think that's all the big ones. Vulnerable damage is great on rings. That's number 1 for a good reason. Definitely want that. Critical strike chance number 2. This is all, yeah. Okay. Hardcore stuff. This build is, you got to be careful. You're going to play hardcore. You can't push content too hard because you're going to be bouncing all over the place. And it's really hard to just know what's happening and play skillfully. The big thing with this one is definitely explosions. Explosions on certain nightmare dungeons, they're going off constantly, and it's like there's not a lot you can do about them. So my recommendation, if you're going to play hardcore, be very careful how quickly you scale this. Make sure you can tank an explosion before, and if you're going to go up, or else you're going to die probably pretty quickly. On this build, that's all I die to. I just died to explosions. That's it. If I ever die, it's to explosions. Grizzly Rage as usual. If you're not unstoppable, watch out for CC. It's gonna be a real bad time if you get stuck in hard CC on hardcore. And there's a couple of small adjustments you make in here. Feel free to make those adjustments. It's not a big difference though. The build's pretty similar either way. Okay, endgame variants. Speed farming. Not a whole lot different. The two things that are the big difference, so to speak, we can use Mad Wolf's Glee. You do not need this. You do not need this. Right now, I actually speed farm without Mad Wolf's Glee because I like being tankier and going a little bit higher on Nightmare Dungeon. I actually I farm right now in the 50s range, the Nightmare Dungeon tier 50s. With Mad Wolf's Glee, I died like once or twice a dungeon. Without it, I don't die at all. So this is a little bit faster, but you can go a little bit less hard content. So there's, a trade-off there, but it is definitely faster. It does more damage. It gives you move speed. It's a solid choice. But Waxing Gibbous, in my opinion, is the bigger difference here. Waxing Gibbous really does smooth out the build quite a bit. You will do less damage on single target for sure. You do not want to push with this because as soon as you stop killing everything in 1 or 2 hits, it just stops working. But for speed farming, this thing is tremendous. Excellent if you get it. If you don't have it though, it's not actually a huge drop off between them. You'll have to manage your spirit a little bit more. Your damage will still be very good. You will still clear very quickly. You'll just have to manage it a little bit more. Yeah, Wax and Gibbous is just a nice build smoother, not a massive power jump like a lot of people seem to think it is. Okay, yeah, and then movement speed, of course we want that, and then Ghost Walker is an option for Storm Shifters. You want to go fast, your damage is fine. You can go either way with that one. As far as the skill tree goes, we are making a significant switch here, which is from Lupine Ferocity to Ursine Strength. Because of Wax and Gibbous, we're going to crit almost all the time. Lupine Ferocity's big benefit over Ursine Strength is not the multiplier, but it's the critical strike addition that it adds. So we crit more often, which has a cascading effect of value. But if we're critting all the time already, then that's lost. So we're better off taking 30% increased damage all of the time versus 70% damage 1/6 of the time. Do the math, one's close to 10%, the other's 30%. It's pretty clear which one wins out there. Do also note that the top of Ursine Strength doesn't count for us. We're never in Werebear form, but the second part is not related to that. Those are disconnected. It only requires you to be healthy, and that's why we take it. As far as Nightmare Dungeon pushing, this build is not going to be the best Nightmare Dungeon pusher, but it still can push it. It can push in the 80s, maybe even the 90s. Don't take Wax and Gibbous, as we talked about earlier. Take Ghostwalkers over Storm Shifters to get access to the ability to move freely through enemies so you don't get trapped. Some more damage reduction is going to be wanted, and some dodge chance. And that's it for gear. And then swap out Natural Hurricane for Savage Hurricane to cause enemies to deal less damage. And you're pretty much good to go on this one. We do have Pinnacle Boss in here. Honestly, thinking about not keeping it in there because I'm not sure this build can even handle Lilith. It may be able to. The big question is, can it do enough damage in single target? It doesn't have access to Wax and Gibbous, but more importantly, it doesn't have just that smooth rotation. It has to do a lot more spirit generation than it would otherwise have to do. It's not going to be able to build up the critical strike damage nearly as quickly in single target as it can in a multi-target environment, so it might not be able to do enough damage to actually kill her. If it can, then it'll do well. Generally speaking, or relatively speaking, it would be a pretty good choice to take. I'm just not convinced it can yet. But if you want to try it out, here's some suggestions that you can attempt. We're going to go a little bit more offense than the Nightmare Dungeon one to try to get enough damage actually out of it and see if it can do it. Okay. Let's talk about the FAQs and the mechanics, and then we are done. Mad Wolf's Glee, talked about this already. We are going to use it, but only as a speed farmer. It's a massive difference in damage reduction, a massive difference in EHP between this and a good chest armor. So don't do any sort of even remote pushing, even getting the relatively challenging content with Mad Wolf's Glee. You're going to die a lot. Temerity is a terrible EHP trade-off versus a legendary. Just don't. It's just not worth it right now. Tempest Roar is excellent. So that's why it's in the build. Hurricane, Cyclone Armor, and Storm Strike all become available to you. They all have huge benefits. This is better than the Legendary. There's no Legendary that can top it right now. And then we already talked about Lupine Ferocity over Ursine Strength. Lupine Ferocity for the crit chance is why we take it over Ursine Strength. But if you're using Wax and Gibbous, go Ursine Strength instead. Okay, mechanics. We talk about damage reduction versus life in pretty much every build at this point. Damage reduction currently has just way better EHP than life. Life does not scale. Life on gear, excuse me. Like, so added life on gear does not scale with increased life, like on gems or on Paragon board, which makes it underperform expectations. Damage reduction sources are better on gear. So that's why we stack those over life in most circumstances. Rings notwithstanding, because you can't put damage reduction on those. And then we already talked a bit about Stormclaw's aspect. Here's a little bit more of a breakdown of what's happening here. That Stormclaw's aspect is effectively double dipping. What it's doing is it's taking whatever the damage scaling is from Shred. So whatever damage Shred does, it takes a percentage of that, and then it applies additional scaling on top of it based upon whatever factors in for it. So like increased damage while the enemy is poisoned does count. Stuff like that will count. It doesn't crit itself, but it will benefit from Shred critting. So that's why crit is so good. There's a number of things here that make a big difference, and this can get into the multiples of damage of Shred, and a lot of people don't notice it because it never crits, so it's always a little white damage, but it's actually usually a lot more damage than the crit you see a big crit, and if you look real close and you look at the white damage, it's larger. That's Storm's Claws going off. It's crazy good scaler right now. Okay, that covers everything on the build. Want to point out one more time, this is coming out a day before the patch, which means we're going to have to almost certainly make adjustments. I can't imagine there's nothing changes. So I will put out more videos, and I will update the max roll guide with the adjustments. You'll also see on there If you look at the bottom, you can always see a change log. So there'll be a change log down there of all the changes I've made, so that you can go back and look and see what's different, and go to the section that's relevant and then adjust accordingly. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great time with this build. This build is so much fun. I hope you enjoy as much as I do. Have a great time in Diablo 4. Good luck in the new season. We're only 3 days out, and I'll see you all again real soon.